Hiya! So welcome back for those that are coming back. Thanks for joining us for everyone that's new. This is going to be one of the bigger projects that I've tackled on this channel so far. We did, of course, have like some projects like the EcoFlow thing where I had a bunch of them, but because the fixes were all very similar, there wasn't a lot of content to be had. It was mostly just recharging some dead cells, plugging the units back in, verifying that everything else works, and that's about it. This one, though, actually did take a little bit of time. Some of you may have seen, some of my long-term subscribers rather may have seen that I posted about this small guy a couple months ago. I think it was back in September. When I originally got them. And I'd actually purchased two units at the same time. I bought the small Yeti 150 and the medium-sized Yeti 400 at the same time off of eBay from separate sellers, but they were relatively good prices and I was looking for this specific brand. And they were both sold in working condition, but they didn't have any batteries. We'll get back to that here in a second. I recently had a chance, though, to pick up the big one. The large Yeti 1250 unit that we have here is the newest to my Yeti collection, and this one was much more expensive than the other ones, but because I kind of wanted to collect them all, as they say, I was willing to spend a little bit more, and because of that, I probably overpaid a little bit, but neither here nor there. All three of these units were sold as working units, so not my normal 4 parts only, but none of them actually functioned when I got them out of the box. The reason being is a little weird. So these units came out in the early days of portable power. Goal Zero, as their name kind of implies, really had a vision of bringing these type of power stations to areas, remote areas in the world where power may not be abundant, but something as simple as a very small battery pack could completely change someone's life. The ability to boil water, for instance, to be able to decontaminate it, or the ability to cook your own food without having to go and get firewood. Things like this were, in some areas of the world, and still are, uncommon. So Goal Zero kind of started out as a philanthropic venture. We're going to go out into the world, we're going to supply power to everyone, and this is our goal, hence the Goal Zero. That was definitely all well and good. They did a lot of great work in the early days. You can see some of their videos on YouTube from 10, 12 years ago, where they really were focused on that one mission. And it seems like somewhere along the way, things kind of strayed a little bit and they got more so into consumer electronics. These first units, though, that Goal Zero produced, they were produced in a way to always be serviceable. So each of these came with some form of lead acid battery, and the lead acid batteries were at the time relatively cheap, especially compared to lithium alternatives, and they allowed easy replacement pretty much anywhere in the world. There's certain battery standard sizes that are available due to things like cars needing to all have 12-volt batteries. So they were able to kind of pick and pull what they wanted to feature in their power stations and then build a power station around those user replaceable batteries. Each one of these units has 4 posts on the top that, once unscrewed, allow you to take the top of the unit off, unplug the battery or disconnect it by unscrewing it for the larger units, and then replace the battery with, again, any one that you have off the shelf. Now, in the early days of lithium ion, when we were talking about our nickel manganese cobalt cells, the 18650s that we featured in the EcoFlow video, those cells, because of their charging and discharging voltages, weren't appropriate drop-in replacements for these kind of batteries. They would generally require a higher charge limit, and they would need to cut off well before one of these units would cut their power off. Because of that, and because of the large voltage difference, you couldn't really place an 18650 pack into one of these batteries and still maintain a reasonable amount of charge, a reasonable amount of use. That all changed when lithium iron phosphate came about, and now we've seen that lithium iron phosphate, in many, many cases, can be a direct swap for an AGM or a lead acid battery. They do allow a lower discharge floor, so you actually do get full capacity out of a lithium iron phosphate. So for instance, on this large unit, this actually calls for a 125 amp hour AGM lead acid battery. Not only is it much, much heavier than an equivalent lithium iron phosphate battery, but because those batteries aren't meant to be deep cycled, meaning you're not allowed, or you're not meant rather, to take them below a certain charge level, otherwise they're going to lose capacity very quickly. Because of that limitation, even though it's a 125 amp hour battery, your usable amp hours may only be 80% of that. So you're actually getting 80, 90, maybe close to 100 amp hours out of a unit like this. When it comes to lithium iron phosphate, they are able to, and in fact it's encouraged in some cases, to drain the batteries fully. They have BMSs built in, so they're not going to discharge more than they should safely, but their charge and discharge rates are very similar to what you see with an AGM battery. Your car's electrical system, for instance, assuming that you have an internal combustion engine car, has an alternator that pushes out around 14.4 volts. And you may say, well, that's only a 12-volt battery. That doesn't make much sense. But that 12-volt battery can actually charge up above 12 volts. 12 volts is the nominal voltage. So usually if you get one fresh off the shelf, they're going to be a little over 13 volts actually. And when one's charging, they can go as high as a little over 14 volts. That's the same exact thing with a lithium iron phosphate battery. This here Okmo branded 12.8 volt, 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery does have a nominal voltage of 12.8 volts. That's kind of like the mid-level voltage, what it would be at approximately 50% of a charge. But the actual voltage range on this is anywhere from 10 volts at its absolute lowest, which you generally don't want to dip down quite that low. I haven't seen where the BMS cuts this one off quite yet. I'll need to do a little bit further testing. I think it was around 10.6 volts when I did my testing, but the cells inside can go down to that level and not be completely shot. The charge, though, on this one can go up to as high as 14.6 volts. It's actually rated at 14.4, but there's a plus or minus 0.2 volt variance in there allowed, so it can go up to 14.6 volts before the BMS is going to cut charging off. And that's almost exactly what one of these units will do. It will push out around 14 volts to charge this up to its max, and it will discharge it down to around 11 to 10.5 volts, which is a safe limit for lithium iron phosphate. So when we're talking about swapping out AGM or lead acid batteries with a lithium iron phosphate battery, in most cases, it is just simply a direct swap. Now this middle guy here was a little bit different. I could have gotten a lithium iron phosphate battery that fit inside of this unit, but because of the limitations on the size, it wouldn't have actually come anywhere close to the capacity of the original battery. My small guy here, absolutely fine. I actually have more capacity in this, and we're going to go over and show how I did that, what's inside of it, and there's still a little bit of a fix that I need to perform on this to make sure it's working properly. The large battery pack here can take up to a group 27 battery. This is a group 24, so it's a slightly smaller battery. And when I talk about group sizes, that's going to be the size that's referenced by like the auto parts stores. And that is just simply the depth, width, and height of the battery. So that's going to determine the size, basically if it's going to fit in your engine bay or not. Same thing with this guy. It can take up to a 125 amp hour battery, but I wanted to go like for like. It calls for a 100 amp hour battery, and that's exactly what this Okmo is going to give us. And I'll show you how we're going to get that installed in here and make sure that it's secured well so that it's not going to have any issues with flopping around or anything like that. This middle unit though, the largest battery that I could find that would fit in there was actually undersized, so it left quite a bit of free space inside of the unit. But for standard sizes, it was the closest that I could get. It was a direct replacement for the battery that came out of here, but because it was the exact same size, it was actually significantly lower capacity. I was going to be swapping out from a approximately 400 watt hour battery to an approximately 300 watt hour battery. That didn't sit right with me, so I wanted to do something a little different, and that's why we're going to come back to this one in our second video on this series. For now, let's tear into these two batteries. We've got, again, our Yeti 150 and our Yeti 1250. And yes, this time it is Yeti. I really thought about calling these Eddies just to mess with you guys, but speech impediments aside, these are Yetis, Y-E-T-I, Yeti. So let's go ahead and start off with our larger of the two units, because this one surprisingly is going to be the easiest one to work on, and show how we can bring this up to the 2025 era and give it a fresh new life. All of these Goal Zero units open exactly the same way. They do have different hex wrench sizes on each of them because obviously there's a significant size difference between the largest and smallest, but they're all very, very similar. And you'll see right up top here on the top of this unit, we've got our 4 bolts. I'm going to get this assembled with the battery and then we'll go over the feature set afterwards. Now on this larger unit, which when you have a full battery in here is significant as far as its weight, it does have some pretty beefy bolts here. So these require an H6 wrench to get them open, or in my case, I'm using a screwdriver. And they thread directly into some posts that go all the way down through the bottom of the unit and really give it some good rigidity to make sure that it's able to hold up throughout multiple uses and carrying it around. Now, surprisingly enough, the battery is not the heaviest part of this unit. The heaviest part of this unit is actually the heat sink on the inverter. Let me show you guys what I'm talking about. So you may be able to see this here, but right up top here, this giant piece of metal is an aluminum heat sink, and it runs the entire length of the body of the unit and is very, very substantial. This is used by all the components inside to cool the unit and make sure that it could work. In this case, they were targeting sub-Saharan Africa. So if we're trying to make this work in the middle of a desert, we got to make sure it's got cooling. And this is definitely sufficient. Compared to every other portable power station that I have, this thing is, I would say, overbuilt. It has got a huge amount of potential, even though it's only rated at 1250 watts as far as its output. Oh, hi, little buddies. I don't like you. The seller that sent these to me sent me along some nice spider friends. We're gonna get those off of there. Spiders have been eradicated. So again, the inverter for this unit is all along the back here, and all of the components are directly connected to this heat sink. It also does have some fans in here as well to move air over the other components, just to make sure everything is cooled evenly. Now you may also see inside of here a bodge of wires. So right underneath our heat sink here, taking a look at the unit, we do have, again, our cooling fans. We've got two that are pushing air out and one that is cycling air back in. We do have some protective covering here just to make sure that fingers don't get into the areas where we really shouldn't have fingers. And then we've got our control panel right up front. There's also this battery tie down, which we need to remove first before we can go any further. To do so, we just need to simply unscrew this, which is that same exact bolt. It's a H6 or hex 6, and then go ahead and lift up and out. Now this bar is completely protected. It's got heat shrink all around it as well as some foam, so it shouldn't have any trouble with crossing over and hitting our battery terminals once we get it in here. Now to get it back topside here. The front panel on each of these units also is something that appears to be modular. So you can actually remove this, and this is where all of your controls, inputs, and outputs are. We're gonna go over those here in just a second as well. This just simply kind of flaps over, folds over to the side to stay out of the way while we're getting a new battery installed. Now the other set of wires that you may have seen were these guys. Goal Zero went a slightly different route with their battery wiring because they wanted these units to be able to connect together in a parallel so that they could charge each other and run off of multiple batteries to get multiple days of runtime. You've got a large amount of 10 gauge wires here all connected together to our battery terminals that go to two places. They go to an Anderson connector on the rear here, which allows you to connect multiple Goal Zero units together and use their batteries all as one unit, one common unit. The second set goes to the AC to DC inverter inside of the unit, and it goes to this control panel, of course, for control. Now on this end, what we're looking at is just simply a couple of M8 screws. So these are, again, just standard terminal screws, very standard when we're talking about things like our Okmo battery here. And so this should, again, just be a simple drop-in replacement. I'm gonna hold these off to the side. We've got positive one side, negative on the other, and they don't really want to cross over, so I need to make sure that I put the battery in that way as well. I've got positive here and negative here. So I'm going to flip that around so that I've got it on the right side, and then we'll just simply lift it into the chassis. Boop-a-doo. The wires do get in the way just a little bit, but they're relatively easy to push out of the way. And the battery should sink in so that it's almost flush with this top lip. All right, real quick, guys, just have to shout out to Okmo batteries. They were one of the first companies that sent me out one of their 12-volt lithium iron phosphate batteries just for the purposes of using it in one of these projects. So again, thank you so much, Okmo. If you want more information about Okmo batteries or would like to purchase them yourself, take a look in the description as well as the pinned comment for some affiliate links to help the channel out. This particular battery was tested on my new testing setup, coming in at a little over 103 amp hours from a full charge. Still got some additional testing to do on that setup before I feature it on the channel. If you would like to see more battery tests, as well as tests on some of the batteries we've already featured, stick around. Now again, this battery is a Group 24 battery. The battery that it calls for is a Group 27 battery, which is a little bit longer, but has the same dimensions as far as width and height. So because of that, I do have a little extra space on either side here. And while I know that battery tie down is going to keep it from lifting up, I do want to put something in here to insulate the sides and make sure that the battery is not shifting as this is moved around. Fortunately for me, I've got a bit of a hoarding problem and I like to keep nice foam. So I've got plenty of this stuff on hand and it looks like it's almost exactly the right size that I need for one side, and then my other foam will fit in the other. Oh yeah, it's just about perfect here. All right, now that I've got my foam in there, the second part that I'm gonna do now that I've got the foam placed inside next to the battery to keep it from jostling around, so we're gonna throw on that top bar. Now this bar should not be pinching any of the wiring, so that's why we wanna do it next. For this little bar here, all we have to do is slot it into one side, push it all the way to the back, and then it should be able to set down and go right back over to its home over here. And again, this bar screws in using the same screwdriver that you had out for the top. They make this nice and easy. And then the terminals that they're using also go in the same exact way. So now that I've got that secure, that battery's not going anywhere. Nice and secure in there. It's not gonna have any issues with moving around, jostling, or arcing. And then all we have to worry about is going ahead and getting these terminals on. Now the person that sold this to me was nice enough to put a nut on the end of this bolt to make sure that all of the terminals didn't come disconnected and that I was able to find the bolts when I needed them. So that made it nice and easy. Fortunately, the thread size here does match the M8 bolts on my battery that I'm using. So again, thank you so much for Okmo for sending that battery out. This was the battery. This is a battery that I'm also featuring in my testing video, so I can show you all what I'm doing to test these batteries. I can tell you though, right now, this one actually passed all of my tests so far. It was able to pull the full 100 amps that it advertises as a constant load. It did have over 100 amp hours of battery capacity. Overall, it's been a fantastic battery so far. Now this second bolt, once I plug it in, because this is connected directly to the inverter, is going to give me a little bit of a spark. I don't love sparks, not my friend. Oh, we didn't actually get a spark. Make a liar out of me. I think I did the last time I did this, but they must still be charged up. Be careful poking your fingers around in here. That tells me that this might not have a discharge resistor in it, because those capacitors should have tried to fill up as soon as I reattached that. Now, when I received this unit in, it did come in and they said that it was in working condition, but I actually couldn't get it to turn on, and I started a claim with eBay and thought that I was going to be putting this project on hold for another 6 months until another one of these came up. Fortunately, it was just a little bit of shipping damage, and there's a connector on the back here that is normally glued from factory, but it came disconnected and it was causing the pack to not turn on. And now with any luck, if I hit this power button and I've got everything connected correctly, we should see the unit turn on. And that's what I got. So we now have a display here. Let's get this reassembled real quickly and then we'll go over the feature set of this before we move on to the smaller unit. Now for those that are wondering, usually on my battery terminals, I do like to torque them down to around 60 foot-pounds. That's what most of these manufacturers call for and is a pretty good place to put them. They do all have locking washers on them, so it's not something that I'm usually too concerned with coming undone. In this case, because they used though a hex or an Allen key, I was not able to use it with my torque wrench. I just don't have the appropriate adapter for it. So I went ahead and used the proper German torque method rather of Gutentite, and it seems to be working okay. I don't expect that I'm going to have this out in an RV or anything, so since I don't even own an RV, so I'm not too concerned with vibration causing those to loosen off, especially with that lock nut on there. I'll button back up here. The unit is on. You can see the screen here displays the battery state of charge. It's not going to be accurate. That's one thing that you will find switching over to lithium iron phosphate, is that the battery state of charge here is going to be highly inaccurate. And unfortunately, that means that once it starts to dip down to a level that is unstable, you're going to lose charge very quickly. So it's going to show 100% capacity for most of the time that it has something plugged into it. Once you get down to that last about 20% is when lithium iron phosphate starts to dive down in the voltage range. And that's when it's going to start to show a trickle on here. Unfortunately, that means that you're showing 100% of the battery for about 70% of its life, and that last 30% is going to go by pretty quickly. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind when you're using this kind of a battery in this kind of a unit. Its functionality-wise, this should perform exactly as advertised. The battery inside of here can put out up to 100 amps continuous, which is more than sufficient to supply the 1250 inverter in here, even at full load, which is around 1400 watts DC, which should be enough to supply the inverter in here, even with its about 80% efficiency. Now, with that said, what can this power? Now, obviously, this is an older unit. This is circa 2015, I want to say, is when this unit came out. And because of that, it doesn't have quite as modern of standards as we would expect. So you're not going to see any USB-C here. In fact, it doesn't have fast charging of any kind. You would want to look into something like a DC jack connector here to allow you to go directly from a 12 volt DC into a high powered USB-C if you wanted to modernize it a little bit, or you could even go out from one of these DC ports here if you had the appropriate adapter plug. That would work just fine, would give you your USB-C power delivery, and should work on pretty much all your modern appliances at least. You do have up top here a PV or solar input, as well as a couple of barrel jack connector inputs. And this unit does have right up top here a little spot where you can store an AC to DC charger. Now this doesn't have an AC charger on board, so you're not going to be plugging AC directly into it like you can with most of our other units. It does charge DC only. Again, a little bit of a limitation of the time and just of the size of the units without having to make them a lot larger to be able to fit in with that AGM battery. Now you do have different selectors here for the different types of ports that you can turn on and off. You've got a 12-volt port here that goes again to a PV style connector, and this is something that you could use if you just needed 12 volt directly to some wires. You also have the 12 volt here, which connects to the cigarette lighter adapter. We've seen those recently, as well as a couple of barrel jacks. Your USB here are going to put out up to 15 watts a piece. So again, not fast charging, but they will charge up a phone. And then you've got 3 AC outputs here. So the outlets here can put out up to 1200 watts continuous max. They can also surge up to 2000 watts for a short period, which again should be in line with what this battery can output. Now this isn't going to have the most efficient AC inverter in the world. Again, we're talking a little bit older technology here, but it's rock dead solid. The components inside of here are old school and they're very large. Because of that, I don't expect that this is ever going to really give us any issue. And this is going to be a power station that I can probably continue to use for many, many, many years. Now that's all well and good, and this unit's actually pretty cool. It has on the back here even an Anderson connector that allows it to do a quick charge with 175 amps, which is more than you should charge this internal battery with, at least on a continuous basis, but it's got that capability. What could you really do with this small guy? Now again, portable battery systems like this, they've been around for quite a while now. This was really one of the first small battery systems that you could change the battery out on. So it was one of the first that was made to really last. Let's see if I can get this big guy out of here without breaking my back again. Oh, Jesus, it's heavier now. So the Yeti 150 here actually has a little bit of a deceiving name. You would assume, based on the 150, that means that it has either 150 watts of output or it has 150 amp hours capability. Definitely doesn't have 150 amp hours, I can tell you that much. The battery that was meant to go in here was a 14 amp hour, again, AGM sealed lead acid battery. This unit on the AC output actually can only output 80 watts at a continuous rate. The inverter can surge up to 160 watts, but it's really not putting out a lot of power. It also has the USB ports on the front, similar to the larger unit here, that are only going to be good for around 15 watts each, and then it has a couple of 12-volt outputs. This guy really, in today's age, isn't of much use. It's not got a large capacity, it's not got a large internal size to be able to put a larger capacity in it, and the inverter's just kind of wimpy. But because of the fact that it did, again, kind of match the theme, we're still going to go ahead and lithium iron phosphate all the things. So for this one, it uses a slightly smaller size hex head. In this case, I'm using a Torque 25, which is not the right head for it. You should be using a hex head, but it's what I got in my screwdriver. And Torques and hex do fit because you're still talking about a 6-point. The difference is that hex is going to give you a lot more torquing power, which again, on a unit this small, not something I'm really worried about. Now, this one's slightly different. Instead of having bolts that go into the unit, it actually just has these little studs that screw onto a bolt inside of the unit. Inside of this unit, laid out similarly to the other, you have all of your controls on the front here. In this case, your inverter board is actually on the front as well. So all of your inverter, AC to DC, DC controls, charging is all done right through this front panel. This, just like the other, does have a front that pulls right off. And what you have here, again, is all of your componentry. The rest of this is just a shell. There's nothing else in here other than the battery, which we'll talk about in a second. So on this board, you've got a little bit of an automotive fuse just to protect it from the input and output that's going in and out of the device. You do have a temperature probe to make sure that it doesn't overheat as it's charging. That is an issue with lead acid batteries as well. So again, something good to have on there. It's got your AC port here, which again is only going to carry a max of 160 watts. So some pretty wimpy gauge wiring on here, as well as another temperature sensor for the main MOSFET to make sure that it doesn't overheat as the inverter is running. Again, this thing is tiny, very, very small, and that's why they really couldn't pack a lot of power out of it. But again, we're using old school components on here. They're very beefy, and I don't expect that this is going to give us any trouble in running once we do get it up and running. Instead of having screw-on terminals, the type of battery that's meant to go in here is similar to what you would find in a UPS at home, an uninterruptible power supply. It just has these small flat connectors, which are simply push-on connectors that usually go on to two battery terminals sticking out of the top of the battery. Now that's not going to quite work in our case, because what I'm using here is something that only a few of you have seen. I actually took this video down because it was a little bit more negative than I wanted to be. But for those of you that did see the Flashfish saga, about 3,000 of you, you may recognize these as being the lithium iron phosphate cells out of that battery. That unit had some flaws, and I wasn't comfortable suggesting it, but I really couldn't make anything good out of it. So I went ahead and took the video down because it was just garnering negative attention, and frankly, I don't think that's anything that any of you would be smart enough to try and buy anyway. You don't usually go looking for the cheapest thing when it comes to something that can catch your house on fire, so it wasn't worth keeping up. I did take the cells out of that pack though. I resecured them. I put some additional layers of tape on here, as well as some insulation between the different cells. I then went ahead and put a BMS on here that's good for up to 30 amps continuous. And I went ahead and put our XT60 connector on the end so that, again, we're nice and protected. We don't have any risks of shorting out here anymore, and they're very solid. These aren't going anywhere anymore. They're not going to rub up against each other and cause a fire. Now this unit here with its BMS almost perfectly fits inside of our Yeti 150. So that's why I'm using it today. The original lead acid battery that would have come in here would have had a capacity of 14 amp hours and approximately 168 watt hours. This unit should have a capacity, based on what's written on the cells at least, of 248 watt hours. So we're going up by a substantial amount. We're getting about 45% better battery over what we would have had in the lead acid, which is pretty rare, not something you usually see, but that's why I still thought that this was worth pursuing. Now again, I've got an XT60 on this side, and then I've got some basic terminals on this side. What I'm going to do is chop these guys off and just simply put an XT60 connector on them that will sit right up front here and allow us to plug our battery in. First off, for everyone that got a headache on the last video, it's this guy's fault. I'm very sorry. I will never use him again. He is now banished to the nether realm and will never return. But now we're back to nice and pretty focus. And look, it works and it's slow and it's nice. Yay. All right. This is the inverter board off of the Gold Zero Yeti 150. We have the back side here, which has most of our componentry for the AC circuit side. So you've got most of that right down here. And then a little bit of smarts for the DC side up top as well for things like the USB charging. On the flip side, our front panel is actually connected directly to the unit. I can unscrew it, but there's really not much underneath it worth looking at. Here you really just have the connectors for all the different ports. You've got that one other temperature probe right up top here, which sits right next to this MOSFET, again, just to make sure it doesn't get too hot during normal usage. And that's about it. Looking right down the middle, again, there's not much on that front of this board here. So what we are doing today is splice in an XT60 connector into the front panel of this unit. That's going to, again, just allow us to more easily integrate it with the lithium iron phosphate battery I have in there. Because realistically, that battery should last about 10 years. I'm probably not going to be replacing it again, so why not just make this a nice and easy connection? Realistically, I could have just soldered them together and it would have been fine as well, but at least this way it'll be modular if I do ever need to take it out and maybe use it on a different project. Now on XT60s, we've discussed this before. Your positive side is always going to be the flat side here, so the port will go on just like that, essentially. And there, we're done. No, I'm just kidding. I still have to solder it in. So we're going to take off a little bit of the sheathing here. We don't want to take off too much because the XT60 connector is not super deep. We'll tin these wires. And again, positive side on an XT60 connector is always the flat side. So we're going to put our positive wire in there. Fortunately, my wire is just rigid enough to kind of hold it on there for me. This is where it gets a little tricky unless you got a set of helping hands, which I do, but I find that they're more of a pain in the butt to have to take out and put back in than just trying to hold it on with your pinky or just bringing something close enough to hold it on for you. The DIY XT60 connectors, they've got a small cup on the end of them that allows you, again, to just kind of place a wire in there and then flood it or fill it with solder. And that gives you a pretty solid connection there. These wires are small enough that they're never going to reach the thermal capacity that an XT60 connector can take. So I'm not worried at all about these potential potentially overheating or causing any issues like that due to a bad connection. With that said, this is about the best kind of connection you can get, because that cup of solder there is fully interfacing with the inside of the cup and with the wire, especially since we pre-tinned them. Now I can push my helping hand out of the way here for this second part. I don't need it since it's held on with the positive wire at this point. Hopefully I can show this to you a little bit better here. So what I'm doing is putting heat. We're going to get a little dab of solder there just to give it some kind of interface. Putting heat right on the wire and on that cup, and then we will feed solder into it, and it melts as quickly as we can feed it, which tells us we got a nice good melt on it. I haven't fully filled the cup quite yet, so I'm going to use a little bit more. And there we go. So now I've got that cup filled. It'll take a couple seconds for it to cool down, and I suggest not touching it during this time. That plastic on the XT60 can get pretty warm. It is a nylon composite, so it shouldn't melt in any way, but something you want to keep in mind. Don't touch it right away. I went ahead and threaded on this end cap, which does go onto the XT60, and that'll just kind of hide those so that there's no risk of them shorting on each other. Now, while we're waiting on that to cool, these are the lithium iron phosphate cells that we pulled out of that fishy power supply before. I again went ahead and did place insulators between the individual cells. It's just a really small piece of cardboard, but again, something that it shouldn't be able to rub through, and it gave it a little bit more rigidity, so it's no longer quite as flimsy as it was before. I did wrap the entire thing in Kapton tape, and there's multiple layers here as I soldered in the BMS. This BMS you may also see as familiar. This is the one that I attempted to use on our 18650 pack before I realized that it was actually the wrong voltage. It was for a lithium iron phosphate pack. So I've since removed it from there, went ahead and reinstalled it on this guy. And instead of using the connector, because I needed this to be as thin as possible, I went ahead and soldered the battery tabs directly to the different ports. So this is our charging input and output, which should control bidirectional on this unit. It does also have a temperature probe that I went ahead and installed in here to make sure that it doesn't get too hot while charging or discharging. Again, not something I expect with how wimpy this unit is. Now that our XT60 is cooled down enough, I will place the cover cap over it. And this just kind of snaps in place. They're a little stubborn sometimes. There we go. And now that it's snapped in, I'm likely never going to get it off again. Perfect. There we go. But you can see that cleans it up real nicely. Make sure that you don't have any risk of anything really getting inside of there and shorting out. All right. Now everything is cooled here. We've got our connector on. We've got our connector ready for our battery pack. This is a little bit of a better look of the inside of, again, the Goal Zero Yeti 150. Nothing real impressive here. You've got these posts that go all the way down to the bottom. Again, a great design. Make sure that you've got some stability when you're lifting this device up, even though this one's going to be relatively lightweight. So the front panel here just simply slots into the body. There we go. Now this can just simply slide over these posts, and it clips into the bottom just slightly. It does have this temperature probe, which is meant to go underneath the battery pack, and so it kind of just sits on top of it. Again, we've got a temperature sensor on the battery itself as well, so really shouldn't have much of a risk of anything going wrong here for thermal events. But from here, we need to go slot the battery in. Now, originally, my plan was to have the BMS facing the front so that we could just have a much easier kind of plug. But it won't actually fit, and that's because of the cigarette lighter adapter here. Right on the end, this 12-volt adapter has a little piece that sticks out just over the foam, which makes it barely fit this unit. And the way that I'm able to do that is because of how these cells are oriented. We have a little bit of a gap here, so it does push in just ever so slightly, and that's where that bolt has to line up with. So from here, the only thing we really need to do is plug our XT60s in together. I am going to just test and make sure we've got voltage coming out of the battery first. I don't want to get into a situation where I turn it on, it doesn't work, and we don't really know why. And perfect, we're getting 12.69 volts out of this. That should be just sufficient, almost nominal voltage for these cells. I expect a little bit of a spark here, so let's see if we get it. Not a spark, but we did get a beep. A beep is good though, because the beep tells us that we probably have a working unit. Let's take a look at the front. Well, hey, nothing's happening. But if I hit AC, we now have a charge indicator. I'm not sure if you can actually see that. It's very basic, and again, is not going to really give us much when it comes to the state of charge on this type of a battery. But we do have that charge indicator there, which pops up anytime you turn one of these components on. Now the last thing to do is just slot the top on. It just simply slots over those 4 posts that we saw before. And then we just have to reassemble our 4 posts. All right, fully reassembled here. We've got our Goal Zero Yeti 150 back up and running. Again, pretty impressive little unit. I really do kind of like the design and the style of this. I wish it had more output capability. It may be something that I explore in the future as far as either removing one of these ports or maybe doing a direct connection to the battery to allow a USB-C to be installed somewhere up front here. But for now, still a unit that is kicking. Again, we're talking in this case, this unit came out in 2013. It is by all intents and purposes ancient. The oldest power stations that we've had on this channel so far were those EcoFlow River Pros, and those came out in, I want to say off memory, either 2018 or 2020. So those are between 5 and 7 years newer than this unit. And we saw how many failures you saw out of that. So really it is impressive that they're able to make these units last this long. I'm really excited to show you all what I come up with for the mid-tier unit. That one was a little bit trickier. I did need to source a different type of battery, something that to me was a little interesting and maybe you haven't seen before as well. We're going to get to that though in the next video. This one's already gone a little bit long, just showing off some of the features and capability of these 2 units. The next video is going to be a little bit longer as well, again, just because that one's much, much more in depth. Thanks though for sticking around, everyone. If you liked what you saw here, leave me a like. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see the follow-up continuation of this series. And I will be back with you all on the next one.